My name is Sarah, and what I'm about to share is a story of unexpected trials that reshaped my life in ways I never imagined. Now in my early 30s, I look back and feel as though I've lived through multiple lifetimes in just a few years. Life in Austin, Texas, seemed perfect when my husband, Daniel, and I were raising our 3-year-old son, Jack, in our cozy home. Daniel worked as a financial analyst, and his job often took him away on business trips. I was accustomed to managing on my own while he was gone, but I never foresaw how much more complex things would become. The first major shift came when Daniel's mother, Margaret, moved in with us. At 65, she had just lost her husband, Daniel's father, and her health had started to decline. She struggled with arthritis and could no longer manage living on her own. Offering her a place in our home felt like the right thing to do, though I knew it would be challenging. At first, things weren't too bad. Margaret was somewhat helpful, and we did our best to make her feel welcome. But soon, things began to change. Margaret's behavior shifted. What began as minor irritations grew into constant frustrations. She started leaving dirty dishes in the sink, promising to clean them later, but that later never came. When I reminded her, she'd apologize, but nothing ever changed. The mess kept piling up, and I ended up cleaning it up myself. Worse yet, Margaret began playing mind games. She'd offer to help with errands or tasks, only to forget or decide she didn't feel like it. It became exhausting, especially when Daniel was away. I felt as though I was constantly cleaning up after her and managing everything alone. Every time Daniel was out of town, the situation seemed to worsen. It was as if Margaret was deliberately making things harder for me. One evening, everything finally came to a head. A storm was brewing, and the sky darkened as heavy clouds rolled in. I was in the kitchen, getting Jack ready for bed when Margaret came in and started criticizing how I had organized things. I tried to stay calm, assuring her that I was nearly done, but Margaret didn't let up. Her insistent, rude comments wore away at my patience. As the storm raged outside, I tried to ignore her, but things took a darker turn. In a fit of frustration, Margaret locked us out of the house. Jack and I were left standing in the rain, unable to get inside. I knocked desperately on the door, pleading for her to let us back in, but she ignored us. I stood there, terrified, clutching Jack close to me, not knowing where else to go. Thankfully, a neighbor saw us and offered to help. We took shelter in a nearby park until the storm passed. I was frantic, trying to keep Jack calm. When the rain finally let up, the police arrived. Alerted by the concerned neighbor, they took us to the local station, where I met with Uncle John, Daniel's uncle. He had been contacted by Daniel, who was worried about Margaret's behavior. Uncle John, a retired lawyer I had always admired, listened intently as I explained everything. He told me Daniel had been concerned for a while, which gave me a bit of comfort, but it didn't change the reality of the mess we were in. At the station, Margaret remained defensive and dismissive when Uncle John suggested I seek legal advice. I felt overwhelmed, not sure what to do next. I didn't want to cause trouble or escalate the situation, but it was clear things couldn't continue as they were. I was exhausted, not just from that night but from months of escalating tension. The thought of dealing with this alone while Daniel was away seemed unbearable. That night marked the beginning of what would turn into a long, difficult journey. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within our family, and I had no idea what the future would bring. But I knew one thing: I had to find a way to protect my family, even if it meant making tough decisions and asking for help I never thought I would need. The days following that stormy night didn't bring any relief. The tension at home only grew. Uncle John, who had been so kind to assist us, advised me to consider legal action against Margaret for her behavior. I felt torn. On one hand, I knew things couldn't keep going this way. On the other hand, taking legal steps against Daniel's mother felt like a betrayal. Back in Austin, the atmosphere in the house was stifling. Margaret acted as if nothing had happened, but her passive-aggressive behavior was unmistakable. Dirty dishes continued to pile up, and every day brought new challenges. It felt like I was walking on eggshells, always bracing for the next explosion. Her mood swings were unpredictable, and I was left managing everything, keeping Jack away from the conflict while trying to hold it all together. Daniel, stationed in New York at the time, called regularly to check in. I would update him on the day's struggles, but his calls always ended in frustration. He wanted to fix things, but he was so far away, unable to do more than offer moral support. I could hear the strain in his voice, and it was clear that his job was putting a growing distance between us. One night, With Daniel still away, Margaret pushed me to my breaking point. She made a mess in the kitchen and then settled down in the living room, watching TV at full volume. Jack was trying to sleep, and the noise made it impossible for him to settle. I asked Margaret to turn the volume down, and she curtly responded, "I'm watching my program." She refused to cooperate. I waited until Jack finally fell asleep, then confronted Margaret. I told her that her behavior was making things incredibly difficult and asked her to be more considerate. Instead of acknowledging my concerns, she became defensive and accused me of being ungrateful. It was as if she was intentionally trying to provoke me. That was when it hit me. Margaret wasn't just difficult, she was deliberately antagonistic. I had hoped things would improve, but instead, they only seemed to be getting worse. It was clear I had to take Uncle John's advice seriously, so I began researching legal options. I consulted with a lawyer who explained that we could potentially seek a restraining order or even look into placing Margaret in a care facility if her behavior became unbearable. The idea of a care facility felt extreme at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it became apparent that we needed to consider every possible solution. I kept in touch with Daniel, updating him without overwhelming him. I knew how much pressure he was under at work, and I didn't want to add to his stress, but I could tell how deeply he cared about what was happening at home. One night, during a phone call, he broke down, admitting that he felt completely helpless. It was heartbreaking to hear him like that, especially since I was dealing with so much on my own. Things took a turn for the worse when Margaret started making cruel comments about Daniel's job, accusing him of abandoning her. She knew he had to travel, but she twisted that into a weapon to make me feel guilty. It was a manipulative tactic that wore me down. Day after day, each new battle drained me, and I began to feel more isolated. The turning point came when Daniel decided to return to Austin for a few days to address the situation himself. He wanted to see things firsthand and help in any way he could. I was hopeful his presence would bring some relief, but I also felt anxious about how everything would play out. When Daniel arrived, the tension in the house was palpable. I showed him the mounting issues with Margaret, from the unwashed dishes to the passive-aggressive comments. Margaret, however, was in complete denial. She insisted that I was exaggerating the problems and that she was being treated unfairly. In an effort to give Daniel a clearer picture, I decided to record one of Margaret's outbursts. It felt risky, but I needed evidence of the verbal abuse that had become a regular part of my life. I hoped that hearing it for himself would help Daniel grasp the severity of the situation. The night before Daniel was set to leave, we had another intense argument. Margaret's words were sharp and cruel, and I captured it all on my phone. Listening to the recording was painful, but it was a necessary step to make Daniel understand the truth. The next morning, Daniel listened to the recording. His face showed a mix of shock and sorrow as he heard Margaret's harsh words. It was clear he was struggling to process the reality of what had been happening. I watched him wrestle with the difficult decisions ahead. As the days passed, it became painfully clear that something had to change. The storm I'd been weathering wasn't just the weather, it was a symbol of the chaos and turmoil engulfing our family. I had hoped things would improve on their own, but I knew we needed to act decisively to reclaim our lives and our home. With Daniel now back in Austin and fully aware of the situation, things began to shift. The recording had been a turning point. It was hard for Daniel to hear his mother's verbal abuse, but it was essential. He needed to understand the depth of Margaret's hostility so that we could make informed decisions about her future. After listening to the recording, Daniel and I sat down to discuss our options. The conversation was heavy, filled with sadness and frustration. We both knew that our family's future depended on the decisions we made in the coming days. "I had no idea it was this bad," Daniel admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I should have been more involved. I just thought, maybe I thought things would get better on their own." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and anger. "I understand. It's been incredibly hard to handle everything on my own, but now that you're here, we need to figure out what's next." We went through our options carefully. The idea of placing Margaret in a care facility was one we had been trying to avoid, but it was becoming clear that it might be the only solution. Her behavior had become so unpredictable and aggressive that living together was no longer safe or sustainable. We decided to look into local care facilities. I reached out to several, gathering information on the services they offered. It was a daunting task, and I felt overwhelmed by the gravity of the decision we had to make. Each facility visit felt like a step closer to an uncertain future, but we couldn't stand still. Meanwhile, Margaret's behavior became even more defiant. She was fully aware of our discussions and grew increasingly combative. She accused us of plotting against her, trying to manipulate Daniel by playing the victim. It was emotionally exhausting to deal with her constant accusations and threats. One evening, Margaret cornered me in the kitchen. Her eyes were cold, calculating. "You think you can just get rid of me, don't you?" she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "You and Daniel are trying to push me out of my own son's home." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "Margaret, we're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone. Your behavior has made it impossible for us to continue living together. We've been looking into care facilities because it's clear we need professional help." Her face contorted with rage. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you? I'm not some old woman you can just toss aside. I'm your family too." I walked away, my heart pounding. It was painful to see her like this, but I knew engaging with her would only escalate the situation. I had to stay focused on what was best for Jack and our family. As the days went by, Daniel and I continued exploring care facility options. Finally, we found one that seemed like a good fit, comfortable, with a compassionate staff. It was a relief, but it also felt like the end of an era. Making this decision wasn't easy, but it was becoming clear it was the only way forward for our family. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best option we had. We scheduled a visit to the care facility to discuss Margaret's potential placement and ensure they could meet her needs. Meanwhile, Daniel had to return to New York for work, which was a bittersweet parting. While I was relieved that he could return to his routine, I couldn't shake the anxiety about facing Margaret alone during his absence. We had set a date for her move to the care facility, and I dreaded the confrontation that was sure to come. The day of Margaret's move was one of the most difficult moments of the entire ordeal. Her resistance was fierce, and it was clear she felt utterly betrayed. Her anger was palpable as we packed her belongings and prepared for her departure. "I can't believe you're doing this to me," Margaret shouted as we loaded her things into the car. "You're tearing this family apart. How could you be so cruel?" I struggled to stay calm. "Margaret, this isn't about cruelty. It's about finding a solution that ensures everyone's well-being. We can't continue living like this. You need professional help, and this facility will provide that." Daniel tried to reason with her, but she was inconsolable. The emotional toll was enormous. I felt the weight of the decision, knowing it was the right one but still finding it heartbreaking. When we arrived at the facility, the staff were kind and supportive. They took Margaret's belongings and reassured us that she would be well cared for. As we left, I saw the sadness in Daniel's eyes. We both knew this was necessary, but it didn't make it any easier. Back at home, the silence was almost suffocating. The house felt emptier, and while there was relief, there was also a deep sadness. I knew we had made the right decision, but guilt and loss lingered. Looking around, I realized we had reached a turning point. The storm had passed, but the aftermath still unfolded. We had taken a critical step in addressing the issues with Margaret, but the future felt uncertain. With Daniel back in New York and Margaret settled in the facility, I had to navigate this new chapter, hopeful that we could finally begin to heal. The day we left Austin for Italy felt surreal. The house was eerily quiet without Margaret's constant presence. Although the transition was bittersweet, I felt a profound sense of relief. Daniel and I had worked hard to get everything in order before our move, and as we packed the last of our belongings, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Jack, who was only 3 but perceptive enough to sense change, clung to me a little more than usual. I reassured him with hugs, trying to frame this as an adventure rather than a daunting shift. Daniel was excited about the new opportunity in Italy, but I knew we were both carrying the weight of our recent struggles. The flight was long, and Jack grew restless, but we kept him entertained with toys and games. Landing in Rome, I was struck by the city's beauty and the sense of possibility it offered. It felt like a stark contrast to the tension and conflict we had left behind. Our new home was in a charming small town, surrounded by rolling hills and picturesque landscapes. The change in scenery was immediately soothing and breathtaking. It was a welcome departure from the stress we'd endured. As we settled into our new house, I felt a flicker of hope that this new chapter would bring the peace and happiness we had been yearning for. Daniel's job in Italy kept him busy, but his role gave him more flexibility, allowing him to spend more time with Jack and me. We explored the surroundings together, and the fresh start began to heal some of the wounds left by our past. I started to make new connections in the community. Joining a local mothers group, I found comfort in talking to other parents who understood the challenges of raising a child in a new country. Their support helped me adjust, and the positive interactions were a welcome change from the negativity we'd faced before. even from a distance. I kept in touch with Sarah's Uncle John. He had been a pillar of support during the tumultuous times in Austin, and his continued encouragement meant the world. He frequently checked in, offering advice and positivity as we navigated this new life. Over time, I noticed that Jack was flourishing in this new environment. The stress of our past seemed to fade as he adapted to his new life. The open spaces, the Italian language classes, and the playgrounds became part of his daily routine, and it was heartwarming to see him so happy. Although I still reflected on the decision to place Margaret in a care facility, I tried to focus on the fact that we had made the choice out of necessity, not malice. I hoped she was receiving the care and support she needed. I worked hard to put aside my feelings of guilt, recognizing that the decision had been in the best interest of everyone, including Margaret. Daniel and I began to look toward the future with renewed optimism. We had faced so many challenges, and we had come through them stronger. Our move to Italy wasn't just about a new location, it was a chance to rebuild our lives, free from the shadows of the past. One afternoon, as I watched Jack play in the garden, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and the gentle hum of Italian life. The tranquility of our new home was like a balm for our souls. Daniel joined us, and we sat together on the patio, enjoying a simple meal. As we talked about our hopes and dreams, the conversation was filled with excitement rather than conflict, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we had a future full of promise. As we embraced this new chapter, I knew the road ahead would come with its own challenges, but we had learned so much about ourselves and each other. We had set boundaries, made difficult decisions, and found strength in one another. The journey had been tough, but it had led us to a place where we could start anew. Moving to Italy was more than just a change of scenery, it was a chance for a fresh start and a new beginning. The echoes of our past struggles were slowly fading, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. With hope in our hearts and renewed purpose, we were ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing we had the strength and resilience to tackle it together.